From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! As Standard & Poor's downgrades America's credit rating, is poor the new standard in America? We'll speak with Barbara Ehrenreich.
Well, the middle class is in barely, it's just been squeezed so much. It almost doesn't make sense to draw a certain line. So many of people who might have considered themselves middle class have been lining up at food banks or applying for food stamps in the last year.
Almost 1 in 6 Americans are on food stamps. Today, we'll speak with Barbara Ehrenreich on not getting by in America. It's the 10th anniversary of Nickel and Dimed, in which the author went undercover as a hotel maid, a waitress, a nursing home attendant, and a Walmart associate. Then we go to Egypt, where the revolution is far from over.
The starkest example of the state broadcast media's acting as a mouthpiece of the regime in the most flagrant of ways was during the revolution.
Democracy Now's Sharif Abdel-Quddus looks at the media in Egypt. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. U.S. and NATO officials are vowing to stay the course in Afghanistan after Taliban militants shot down a U.S. military helicopter west of Kabul Saturday, killing 38 people, including 30 U.S. troops. For U.S. forces, it was the bloodiest single incident of the 10-year-old Afghanistan war. 22 of the dead were members of the elite Navy SEALs, including many who were members of SEAL Team 6, the unit that conducted the bin Laden raid. U.S. officials said the helicopter carrying the Navy SEALs was on a mission to target a high-level Taliban commander. But Afghan officials say the Taliban may have lured U.S. forces to the scene by tipping them off that a Taliban meeting was taking place. Brigadier General Karsten Jacobson is a NATO spokesperson.
The incident, as tragic as it was in its magnitude, will have no influence on the conduct of operations. It was a tragic day. It was a tragic loss. We suffer wounded and death every day. The campaign is going to continue. We will continue to relentlessly pursue the enemy in the fight that we are taking to them.
Meanwhile, 4 other NATO soldiers were killed in separate militant attacks on Sunday. In a move that has shaken the world's finance markets, the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's has downgraded the United States AAA credit rating for the first time. In its report, S&P explicitly blamed the political process in Washington and the refusal by Republicans to raise taxes. S&P writes, quote, "We have changed our assumption on this because the majority of Republicans in Congress continue to resist any measure that would raise revenues, a position we believe Congress reinforced by passing the act," unquote. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner criticized S&P's decision.
S&P's shown really terrible judgment, and they've handled themselves very poorly, and they've shown a stunning lack of knowledge about basic U.S. fiscal budget math. And I think they drew exactly the wrong conclusion.
Democratic Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts appeared on Meet the Press Sunday. He blamed the Tea Party for the credit downgrade.
I believe this is, without question, the Tea Party downgrade. This is the Tea Party downgrade because a minority of people in the House of Representatives countered even the will of many Republicans in the United States Senate, who were prepared to do a bigger deal, to do $4.7 trillion, $4 trillion, have a mix of reductions and reforms in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but also recognize that we needed to do some revenue.
Some experts say the credit downgrade could result in higher interest rates for home mortgages, credit cards, car loans, and other loans to consumers and businesses. Meanwhile, the latest government data on unemployment shows the nation's job crisis remains severe. The share of the eligible population holding a job declined to 58.1%, the lowest since July 1983. The official unemployment rate dropped slightly to 9.1%, but that was largely due to people leaving the labor force. 45,000 unionized workers of Verizon have entered their second day on strike. The strike was called after negotiations broke down between Verizon and two unions representing the workers, Communications Workers of America and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Verizon was attempting to cut health and pension benefits for workers and make it easier for the company to fire workers. Verizon is the nation's second largest U.S. phone carrier. It earned $6.9 billion in net income for the first 6 months of the year. It's the first strike at Verizon in 11 years. A federal jury has found 4 New Orleans police officers guilty of civil rights violations over the shooting deaths of 2 civilians in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and a subsequent cover-up. But the jury stopped short of calling the shootings murder. A 5th officer was found guilty of a host of charges related to the cover-up. The charges were linked to the New Orleans police shootings on the Danziger Bridge in 2005 that killed 2 civilians, 17-year-old James Brissett and 40-year-old Ronald Madison, and seriously wounded 4 others. Saudi Arabia has recalled its ambassador to Syria as the Syrian regime continues to escalate its violent crackdown on protesters. In a statement, Saudi King Abdullah demanded an end to the, quote, killing machine and bloodshed. There are reports the Syrian army shelling the eastern city of Deir al-Zur for a second day. Syrian activists say at least 100 anti-government protesters were killed Sunday. British police arrested more than 100 people last night in London following a second night of unrest in some of the city's poorest neighbourhoods. Riots first broke out Saturday night in the North London section of Tottenham following a vigil for a 29-year-old man shot dead by police as they tried to arrest him. Local residents said the rioting was sparked in part by anger over high unemployment in the neighbourhood and cuts in public services. The New York Times has revealed the United States has increased its involvement in Mexico's bloody drug war. In recent weeks, CIA operatives and former military personnel have been posted in a Mexican military base in the northern region of Mexico, manned by Drug Enforcement Administration agents, CIA officials, and retired military personnel. The intelligence outpost is modeled after compounds operated by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. For the first time, U.S. operatives are reportedly working alongside Mexican authorities in collecting information about drug cartels and planning operations. Officials from both countries are also considering embedding private security contractors in a specially vetted Mexican counter-narcotics police unit. In addition to efforts at intelligence collaboration, the United States has also begun flying unmanned drones over Mexican soil in recent months. The Israeli Knesset is planning to hold an emergency meeting to address the nation's growing protest movement. The legislative body is expected to convene Wednesday or early next week. Sharply rising prices of housing, fuel, and food have prompted widespread demonstrations throughout Israel in recent weeks. On Saturday, as many as 300,000 people marched in Tel Aviv.
Once we had the smallest gaps between rich and poor. We had the smallest gap in the world. Today we are #1 for the largest gaps between rich and poor. And I think what we're seeing here tonight, what we've been seeing for the past few weeks, so people have simply had enough.
Despite the outpouring of discontent, the Israeli government announced earlier today it had approved an increase in electricity prices. Texas Governor Rick Perry led 30,000 people in a prayer at a controversial rally in Houston this weekend called The Response, a call to prayer for a nation in crisis. The 7-hour gathering was designed by Perry and sponsored in part by the American Family Association, which opposes same-sex marriage and has condemned Muslims. The event, which drew 30,000 people, was also backed by the International House of Prayer, whose evangelical founder argues Oprah Winfrey is a satanic religious leader. Though billed as an apolitical day of prayer for a nation in crisis, the response was filled with calls for an end to abortion and gave Governor Perry the opportunity to appeal to Christian conservatives. Perry is widely expected to soon announce his candidacy for president. Critics denounced the gathering for blurring the lines between church and state. The response was dwarfed in comparison to Houston's first-ever citywide back-to-school event held just 7 miles away on Sunday. An estimated 100,000 people showed up to receive free backpacks, school supplies, uniforms, haircut vouchers, immunizations, and fresh produce. The demand for the much-needed supplies was so great, officials were forced to shut the event down at 10 a.m. and turn people away. Immigrant rights groups are criticizing the Obama administration for unilaterally pushing ahead with its Secure Communities program, a controversial federal immigration enforcement policy that requires local police to forward fingerprints of every person they arrest to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In recent months, the governors of Illinois, New York, announced they had pulled out of the program. But now officials from Immigration and Customs Enforcement are saying the program is not voluntary and that local governments cannot opt out of it. On Friday, ICE sent a letter to local and state governors terminating all existing agreements with jurisdictions over the program. ICE says the agreements were no longer, quote, required to activate or operate secure communities. Tibet's government in exile has sworn in Harvard academic Lobsang Sangay as its new prime minister. Making his inaugural speech, Sangay vowed to fight what he called Chinese colonialism and sought to dismiss suggestions that the eventual death of the 76-year-old Dalai Lama would mark the end of Tibet's resistance movement. Critics have argued Sangay's lack of experience in Tibetan administration will present serious challenges to his new role as leader, replacing the Dalai Lama. One of soldiers convicted of abusing Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib was released Saturday after serving more than 6 years in a Kansas military prison barracks. Charles Grainer was released after serving more than 6.5 years of a 10-year sentence. Grainer was photographed at Abu Ghraib giving a thumbs-up sign behind naked Iraqis piled into a pyramid and grinning over a corpse. Japan commemorated the 66th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima in a ceremony that focused on both the 1945 attack and the nation's ongoing nuclear crisis. Japan continues to suffer from the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, following the meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi power plant caused by a massive mid-March tsunami. Prime Minister Naoto Kan honored the dead from the World War II atomic bombing, then said he deeply regretted believing the so-called security myth, which suggested Japan could be safely powered by the same atomic forces that instantly killed 70,000 Japanese people over 6 decades ago. The acute effects of the Hiroshima bombing would eventually kill an estimated 166,000 people. In the wake of the most recent crisis, polls show 70% of Japanese public wants nuclear energy phased out. Tomorrow marks the 66th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of Nagasaki, which followed the attack on Hiroshima and left at least 75,000 people dead. And former Republican Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon has died at the age of 89. Hatfield was a longtime critic of the nation's excessive military spending. In 1970, he joined Democratic Senator George McGovern in sponsoring an amendment to bring U.S. troops home from Vietnam. He later spearheaded an effort with Senator Edward Kennedy to freeze the nuclear arms race, and in 1990 was one of only 2 Republican senators to vote against going to war in the Persian Gulf. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.